Hey there. All right, new tea time, right? So I'm Dr. T. If you don't know that, I'm sure that you know all 10 of you watching this. I'm like, all right, we know who you are. Um, Today I am having some heart chakra tea. It's this in this lovely glass bottle that I have here. It's got some lemon balm, some nettle, some lady's mantle, ginger, hawthorn berries, rose petal, rose hips, and hibiscus. Again, another non-caffeinated, lovely floral tea. It's like the middle afternoon, so for me, that's the kind of tea I need to have. Um, so today the focus of this talk is actually going to be around perfectionism, the poison of perfectionism actually. And it I decided to go this route because it really ties into the other things I've been talking about. And if you were to actually step back and kind of just watch all these videos that I create together, it's really just painting a big picture narrative. It's looking at kind of all these systemic pieces. We're just kind of taking it piece by piece, breaking it down. But you'll hear and kind of see these connections between each one of these things that we're talking about. And so, if we're talking about this concept of perfectionism, right? I mean, it comes up so often, and it is the reason people are driven to exhaustion. I mean, I know that I personally have to face it and deal with it all the time. I have spent a lot of time and work really keeping that in check because when you have kind of this core need to be the absolute best, not your personal best, but the absolute best, there's this feeling of always being not good enough. And so it's figuring out, well, how can I be good enough? But the issue is that like good enough doesn't exist when you're striving for perfection. Good enough will never be enough if you're striving for perfection. And so not good enough is going to become the core of your story, and it's going to become the core of who you are. And so I mean, if we think of, let's see, Voltaire, right? Voltaire said that the enemy of the good is the best. And so we're just going to kind of go into this a bit because, um, and not only, yes, have I like personally had to deal with this, but I also have a collaborative and working with teachers, and I've been a teacher, right? It is the biggest reason for, teacher burnout, right? Perfectionism, this need to be the perfect teacher and never mess up. It is the greatest driver for burnout, and it's the greatest driver for burnout in many places. But one place where it really is an issue is with our youth. And so the young people that I've worked with, the young people that I researched, this idea of perfectionism just kept coming up over and over again, right? And it set up these unrealistic expectations that these youth were never going to be able to achieve, but they felt that they had to. And so then they started creating versions of themselves to kind of meet this set of perfection, so that they would be accepted, that they would be loved. And so in my research, which I'm actually going to just put the link in the description this time around, which I haven't done, in this research, I created this, there was this culture, this, I can't think of the term, I mean, I'll just use the word culture. That's not domain. That's what it is. This domain that I called the pursuit of happiness. And their pursuit of happiness was full of things like the American dream, right? And perfectionism was one of them. And this idea that we have to kind of be based on this individualistic, perfectionistic. It's all about all our accomplishments. It's about competition. It's about materialism, right? That is ultimately setting up this idea of this is how I'm happy, right? This is how I find happiness, is by achieving what is being set before me as this kind of ideal of perfection. And so what ended up happening is there was actually this adaptation that occurred, right? These youth created pseudo identities. They made up versions of themselves that were accepted as kind of perfect, great, grand, and whatever by certain groups, by certain individuals, including parents, including family members, right? So they started doing this thing called shining the self. And that's a term that I coined. It's in my research also. But shining the self, right? I am kind of creating this super, super shiny version of who I am because I think that's what I need to do. I have to completely maintain my external facade so that you think I'm okay and worthy of being a part of your group, of belonging in some way. And yet, what's happening in this shining of the self, right? If you think of anything shiny, there's always a shadow side to it. And so, ultimately, what's happening is in this shining of myself and focusing externally constantly, my inside is just getting darker and darker. I'm getting more and more depressed. I'm getting sad. I'm getting completely disconnected with who I am. I'm just becoming a void because I'm not using any energy to actually fill me up and figure out who I am. I am just simply spending all of my time outside making sure that you're okay with who I am. And that's really the culture that's been created for a really long time. And it's the culture that is perpetuated. It's the way that our system and the conditions of our system keep this going, especially if we consider the concept of capitalism, right? I mean, that is what it is, right? You need to have stuff. You need to have a certain type of house, a certain car. You have to look a certain way, dress a certain way in order to really live the happiest life. And in reality, all we're doing is saying that you can meet all your needs with money and looking outside of yourself when all you actually have to do is go within. You actually have to do is go within and face kind of the stuff that you're holding, the stuff that you're carrying, and really become one and okay with you, as opposed to staying outside and focusing everywhere else. And so this shining the self, it becomes a social process, and it's something that these youth learn super early on. I mean, really young, 4, 5, 6 years old. They're starting to learn already that they're not good enough. There's something different about them. And so instead of embracing their uniqueness, embracing this difference, they start to figure out, okay, well, what is going to work? What's going to get the best response from everybody around me? And so then they start to play into this. And then ultimately, what ends up happening is it becomes just kind of this fallback approach. So even when we get, especially after they've practiced this for years and years and years, and we try to say, okay, well, let's actually get to know your real self and be really comfortable kind of making mistakes. Right. And just kind of owning them. And it's all right. Tripping and falling in front of people, not a big deal, is not going to make you a bad person. And so when we start to get to that place, it is really, really difficult because it is not possible to be perfect and vulnerable at the same time. And to be human is to be vulnerable. To be human is not to be perfect. Life is not perfect. It is not possible to be perfect. And the more effort you put into making it perfect, the more difficult it is, the more exhausted that you get. Right? So, and then if we consider these young people, the other thing that they're experiencing on kind of working with, which is actually, I think, is part of the technology world that has kind of eked into all generations, is that social media can be used to create any version of ourselves, right? We can put any profile picture up and that becomes who we are. And the craziest thing about it is that we can actually look at that and we start posting pictures and writing certain posts and doing these things. And we actually start to believe that's who we are. We start to fill our own self-fulfilling prophecy, right? And so if you consider, like, if you're a parent or a teacher or somebody, and you consider the fact that, these young people maybe are posting super provocative photos, or, their profile pictures are super sexualized, imagine the culture that's accepting it. Imagine the society that is around them, and imagine what they feel they have to do to feel beautiful, to feel dominant, to feel accepted, superior. I mean, whatever it is. And so when they're doing these things, yes, I mean, of course, we don't want to see that, but understanding why that's happening and also understanding our role in this, because this happens very early on, especially, I mean, if we think of parents kind of setting up this need to be competitive, being the best of the best, right? You kind of hard work gets you there. I mean, and this isn't all parents. I mean, this is typically mostly something we see in affluent communities, but that's also something we think kind of living the best life is having kind of the most money and having the most stuff. And so people will look to how affluent communities act. And this perfectionism issue is really like, we can't actually talk about our problems. We're promoting a completely unblemished self, right? You're not allowed to have an issue. You're not allowed to say, oh no, we've got some stuff going on, because for some reason there is this kind of cultural acceptance and concept around, if we are perfect, like if we have money and if we have all this stuff, we aren't allowed to have problems. And that's just absurd, because we all have problems. So, I mean, social media we could talk about for days. And of course, technology in general right now is magnificent, right? I wouldn't be able to be doing this if we didn't have technology. We wouldn't be able to speak globally across the world, have meetings of people across the world without it. But there's also this piece that's really shifting. It's isolating, and it's kind of helping us really perpetuate this perfectionism need, right? If we were to shift what it looked like, kind of throw all of our, what we would maybe consider flaws out there, which aren't even flaws, it's just part of ourselves, right? Um, but anyway, so if we think again, perfectionism, there's different kinds. I'm not going to go into all of them. But I'm going to talk about two, because I think there's two that are kind of really important to just throw out there and are really interesting to talk about. But there's effortless perfection. And I find that term fascinating, because effortless perfection is kind of an oxymoron, right? If you think about it, the amount of effort it takes to be perfect, which is of course not possible, is insane. Okay, so it's this idea that we can be good at all things without any effort. You just think about that. We can be good at all things without any effort. No. And this idea is disingenuous and dangerous, because the amount of effort it does take to stay at the top of our game is exhausting. And it can actually deprive us of nurturing things that are actually likely to fuel our ability to be outstanding. Every single individual in this world is outstanding and extraordinary. They just have to understand what it is that they are outstanding and extraordinary. I mean, there is no perfect box. Everybody's unique and an individual. And so, this idea of trying to meet the need of being perfect doesn't allow us to be our own extraordinary. And this will impact things like relationships, downtime, freedom to think creatively, and lack of self consciousness, right? I just don't even know me, who I am, if I exist in this world, because all I am is a body that's adapting to all of these surroundings, right? I become this chameleon, right? This is if you start going into developmental psychology and, all this, and go into the chameleon ego and all these pieces, right? It's all there, and it's very prominent in our culture and especially our young people. And it's because we're teaching them that, right? We're modeling it beautifully. So there is also maladaptive perfectionism. Okay. And this is driven by the intense need to avoid failure and to appear flawless. Okay. Avoid failure, right, and appear flawless. I was a science teacher for a very long time, and something that I like my goal all the time was to teach them it was okay to fail, right? Because that is the only way we succeed. It's the only way we figure it out. It's how we kind of figure out what we're good at, maybe what we're not, what we don't like, what we do like, right? And it's a way to kind of face the things that we need to face. But if we're trying to be perfect, that is not an option, right? And this is going to deal into the anxiety piece, right, that I talked about in another video. And it'll feed into a bunch of other things. But this maladaptive perfectionism actually has its roots very often in kind of our parenting relationships. Because if we have relationships with parents that were demanding, critical, and conditional relationships are kind of one of the biggest reasons that a young person will start to strive for perfection, because that means approval is conditional on performance, right? You only give good praise or the best praise when they did something good. And so that is automatically showing them that my approval is conditional on me being the best at something. I'm thinking of one of the young people that I interviewed, and that came out in the research. And there was this very clear moment where she said, I remember doing the best in this kind of writing competition. And this was really maybe second, third grade. And I got, the first prize, and I came back and I told my parents, and it was the most attention I had ever gotten. And so I realized, and I started paying attention, that all me and my siblings, depending on who was doing the best, would determine who was getting the most attention. And so then I just decided I had to be the best at everything. So that right there just kind of points out how impactful this kind of conditional acceptance actually is. And we see this not just in parenting roles, right? It gets reinforced as these youth move into schools, into teams, throughout the world, right? We kind of promote this conditional acceptance based on how well we're doing. So that's fun, right? Because really what happens is there's the closeness and affection that should be there, is bound to suffer. And it's bound to suffer because these young people, kids, youth, students, whoever you're working with, right, or whoever you have or live with, they will start to hide their deep-seated feelings of insecurity and vulnerability. And those are core to every human being. And we have to be able to, especially as young people, have to be able to talk about it to know how to navigate it. But instead, they just start to hide it. They start to pretend like everything's okay. And so it's like, yeah, my kid's doing great, when in reality, they're not. They're not. These feelings that they have excessively high standards and that they're expected and necessary to win approval, typically lead to intense feelings of hopelessness, right? I have no hope or belief that, like, I'm going to accomplish anything because I'm never good enough. And this tendency to focus on and overly value external measures of accomplishment are directly related to high rates of depression and substance use. We have seen a higher rate of depression, substance use, and suicidality than we've ever seen before. And we have to understand that it's not just, on these kids. We have perpetuated a cycle of avoiding ourselves, avoiding healing ourselves. And we've been passing down this trauma for generations, keeping the conditions set so that not only do we have super anxious and sensitive beings, but we force them to stay outside of themselves. So they actually don't know how to navigate who they are. They don't build an internal home. They have no place to find that rest, relaxation, and just kind of, I need to kind of go away and kind of figure this out. It's this constant search, and it's just exhausting. Um, and chasing perfection is a great way to have life pass you by, right? Because you are unable to stay in the moment. It keeps you focused on the future. And the worst part about it is if we are a parent, a teacher, a therapist, or whatever we are, and we are really kind of caught up in this. We need you to be the perfect client, or the perfect student, or the perfect child, or I mean, whatever it happens to be. If we're focused on that, we'll never actually see the child sitting in front of us, because we're actually looking for a child that doesn't exist. How do you think that impacts them? The pursuit of perfection simply is a diversion from the messiness of life, right? Life is messy. Showing our youth how to move through it and live through it and be okay and get better and succeed and have to go back through it and make it through, that is one of the most powerful things we can do. Instead of pretending like everything's fine and okay, not talking about the fact that this person is maybe passing away and on their way out of this world. That we have a culture and society that is completely terrified of death, and it's because we don't have a relationship with it, and so often we just don't talk about it because we don't want to scare anyone or hurt anyone's feelings, or we have no idea how to have that conversation. It's okay if we don't know how to have the conversation. What's important is that we have it. What's important is that we keep lines of communication open, because kids especially have questions. They always have questions, and the first person they're going to go to is their parents. Then they're going to find some other adult that might listen to them. And if nobody listens to them, nobody hears them, no one tries, then they're going to stop asking questions. And that is terrifying, right? And we want these youth to develop authentic senses of self. And it's very hard to do that with the constant pressure to adopt an unblemished self. Okay? You have to be super skinny. You have to be beautiful. You have to be smart. You have to be powerful, right? You have to be all of these things. Why? Why is that necessary? Why isn't it you would just have to be you? You are perfect because you're the only one that is you. You're the only one that can figure that out. It's just difficult. It's a difficult situation because it is so deeply ingrained and embedded in our world. And I desperately hope that we start to just remove the need, or at least face it, maybe start having conversations around it, maybe facing that fear on just being real, walking out of the house without your hair done and makeup on. I know that might be hard, but I could go on for a long time about this. So if you have questions or you're interested, I'm just going to, again, stop there, keep these kind of short, just give you some food for thought. But I would love us to really start to see the youth that are standing in front of us. Love to see the person we're actually looking at in the mirror, as opposed to completely missing these individuals because we think we need to see something else. So I hope you are all well. I hope you know you're all perfectly imperfect. And I hope you embrace that. Peace.